We firstly looked at our destination, our vision of where we want Montserrat to be over the next, say, 20 years. Included in that is trying to determine how long is our next sustainable development plan. That would actually be the fourth plan, although some weren't called plans. First was developed in 1998, the second one in 2003 to 2007, the third developed in 2007, 2008, that's the one you have before you, 2008 to 2020. The planning process should have started in about 2019, but you had, not the election like what we just had, you had national election and then COVID-19. That slowed down the process, so a bridging process was developed that could take you 2022, 2023. So this planning process that now starts would be for about a year. That should finish somewhere in 2022 and be ready for the new process, the new plan for whatever duration. The methodology we are using is fairly similar to the methodology that was used to bring together the 2008 to 2020 with some tweaking, a toolkit. And the first in the toolkit had to do with the visioning exercise. And the visioning included the vision statement, the values, the vision pillars, and the goals. The view was that in the 2008, that the goals were 5. But in the 2013 review, the goals were synergized into 4, with population having a hectic debate in 2007 that led to a goal by itself being population. And at that stage, population was nearer or around 7,000. And the goal had estimated that population would move to about 9,000. The population has, in fact, moved in the opposite direction. And rather than 7,000 today, is just under 5,000. So the debate continues as to whether go back to 2013 with population as a cross-cutting team, or you go back to a separate goal, or how do you find ways of growing the population? And secondly, how do you find ways of mixing the experienced persons with the youth, especially with the understanding that the population now is considered aging and a pull on the social system. So if you're not replacing the population, and there's been a lot of discussion about what the minimum population that your economy will thrive on, right? And then included in the tools in the vision is how long the plan is for. Having done all of that, we come back to the current reality. And we reviewed what has been accomplished, what we set out to do, and that we have done. Some of them done well. Some is difficult to measure because we are almost calling them partial achievement or partial accomplishment. In some instances, the governance framework has been done, but the implementation hasn't taken place. But there are some accomplishments. There are a longer list of non-accomplishments. And the question is, were all the actions and the indicators and everything that we set out to do in 2008 realistic? Was it all achievable? And could we have fulfilled everything? So, in addition, we moved from accomplishment and non-accomplishment to take on board the opportunities and trends. That is, since 2008, there are several opportunities that has come on board that might be blended with your accomplishment and non-accomplishments. For instance, if we take energy that everybody is concerned about, we were in 2007 heavily talking about geothermal energy. And the achievement has not been around geothermal, but should it have been alternate sources of energy? Because some achievements have taken place in alternate sources of energy, in solar. And some of the discussion have said, historically, Montserrat, and you have all of the wind. So should that also move towards wind energy? And should we be more zeroed around solar and wind? And whenever geothermal come on board. So that's why I said there are opportunities that might also be blended with your accomplishment, because you did accomplish some alternate energies in solar. It wasn't the same as you had set out to do, that you were going to look at geothermal, but there are opportunities to go back to broaden to wind and so on. So that's the second component, using the opportunities. And finally, looking at the challenges that might have affected why you did not accomplish, right? And the way that actions are determined are whether they help. You want to make sure that you create actions that minimizes the challenges if they don't eliminate the challenges. Having known where you want to go, know where you are, you need a vehicle to get there. The journey is the plan. 3 of the 4 workshops, sector workshops, got to the point, and we explained that the governance did not conclude with the action planning, but we are going to find ways of filling that in. Nevertheless, of the other 3 sector workshops, there were some 46 actions that were developed. And some might be cross-cutting because some talk it through. And what we attempted to do is also to integrate into the actions that we look at the most priority actions, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals put out by the United Nations. And those are looking at, were developed to 2030. So our destination, if it's longer than to 2030, would look at not only the periodical review, which persons have indicated should be a 3 to 5 year old period, but the moment the United Nations come up with a new set of sustainable development goals, it might mean a major revamp if our plan goes beyond that. So of the 46, and including your experience, we had a handout that brought forward the 26, and also those 46 indicated which agency should lead and which agency or agencies would support. You look at them, and in 10 working tables, you selected your top 3. And those are laid up across the table. And we had the usual robust session of then prioritizing those by each person, and there was a call to the Electoral Commission that instead of having 3 votes, we should have 5. So the Electoral Commission gave in to the democratic process and allowed for 5 votes. Some of them were cross-cutting. And so the outcome of this is that on top of the goals, healthcare with 34, and closely followed by food security with 32, education and training with 21, power generation with 21, so it's equal, population with 17, development unit and resources with 17, another tie, access 16, business development 11, housing 5, disaster risk reduction 2, and creative industries and digital economy 2. Now there are some groupings in there that we had to do, and these will be spelled out in the full workshop notes. So the group meeting today had a clear-cut view that the main 2 actions by far has to do around healthcare. And all of the workshops actually discuss healthcare very heavily. Primary healthcare, secondary healthcare. From both current reality and actions. So your instructions is that healthcare ties in actually with population, because the views coming out is that you also have an aging population. There was also the discussion around the factor that if you are going to attract other persons coming in, they have to be assured that they have access to health care as well as education, right? So food security has been another thing, and in some way there are interconnections because it's what the population grow and access that comes out of it. Education up there, along with, I gave the example of power generation as one of the cross-cutting things, population. There's a series of actions around this, and a series of discussions around that. Resource for development, that's tied back to dependency on the UK government, and how do you look at some of that, and whether you need a discrete development unit, different from a push for a business that's driven by the private sector, a business development unit. So this is government more, this is private sector more. And access, we don't have to describe that. It's whether by air, by sea, how do you come into the... Although there's been a lot of discussion about housing, affordable housing, and not just affordable, but appropriate housing. So, for instance, a lot of the discussion has been, yes, you might do affordable housing. Maybe the housing stock was done to withstand level 3 hurricane. Appropriate houses might need to be withstand level 5 hurricanes. And although this is reflected low in this, it's actually reflected a lot in the discussions about disaster mitigation, reduction, and so on. And the idea of maximizing the fiber optic cable and the type of creative industries to have a particular niche in the industry. So that's what is reflected. Comments? Yeah. You can use the mic.
Yes, what was I saying? Yes, it was interesting to see the results. But yes, but one wonders if is it reflective of who's here? Because as my my colleague in crime has said, that maybe housing was low because most of the people here pretty much own their own homes. And exactly, the other thing too is in terms of the demographic. So it's important, as you were expressing before, it's the consensus, but the consensus of which grouping, and how do we take these things forward, being able to ensure that we capture some smaller groupings or less reachable groups, and the business community, etc., who are critical also in looking at how we are planning and what we are putting in this plan. How do we capture those groupings that generally are not as present as some of us here?
Thank you. A crucial point, because how we integrate youth has been at every workshop. We hoped to have had during this time here a focus group with youth. We are going to have that focus group with youth, and your part about youth, and that we're not sure how we'll integrate children. There's usually an age that's considered youth. Last time, children, we had some focus group with school children. And so we will think that through, and I'm sure Ms. Estwick will have a little more to say on that. Because that's crucial, that has been something that has come up in every workshop, that if you don't motivate the young, then they're either going to be outward migration or they're not. They're going to have an apathy towards the plan. Yes, sir.
Thanks.
It's on.
I'm enjoying the day and enjoying the presentations and stuff. And I like exactly what I've actually seen here today. But there's one or two things that I have my concern about. And I'm happy that we have the opposition leader of the opposition leader here today. And as we move forward, what is our national priority? Because as you realize, somebody just indicated, oh, sorry, Mr. Castle, I have to call his name. Mr. Castle indicated that housing is low. But what is our priority? If you go through the entire country, everyone have their own priority. The government of the day, what is the national priority? I know that my very good friend, I think on this side of me, would say, we don't see tourism. Because in the last SDP, tourism was up front. I'm happy to see healthcare and food security there. So I think that we should actually spell it out with as community going forward. What is our national priority? The other thing that I am not sure how many of us within at the national level or the diaspora is familiar with SDG 2030. And seeing that we're now linking that with our sustainable development goal for the next, let's say for the next 15 years, 10 to 15 years, how can we, Ms. Eswick and the educators, how can we now get it into the heads of the youths what the STPs are all about? Because there's all linkages. Because we have 17 SDG goals, but when you really break it down, they all linked within, you can break it down to somewhat 5. So that is one of the things that we actually need to do within in-house, in Montserrat, to sensitize the public or educate the public as it relates to the SDG 2030. Thanks.
Right. Right. And a few more comments, and then I'm going to bring Angela up after a number of other comments, because it's nicely rolling towards the next steps.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think something that I have been missing for the entire day is how do we focus who we are as a people and our core beliefs in what we want to see. And I am hearing that housing is low. And it is low, but what is our thought pattern as a people when it comes to housing? And is it the same for what it was for my parents and for me, what was passed on to me? Passed on to me is you work and you own your home, you build your home, you live in it. Is that still a Montserratian thought pattern, or are we shifting away from that thought pattern? What is it as a people that we are seeing? And it goes for everything. Healthcare, food, what is it that we want as a people, and how our culture, our history is affecting how we interact with all of these pieces to build what we want as our Montserrat. I think we need to consider that as well.
Yeah. And that's crucial, because interestingly, a lot of the international documents talk about shelter versus housing, because there is a variation in shelter. All right, and I think there was a hand up somewhere after. You just indicate and just go to the mic. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to just highlight three areas. One, my friend here who spoke about tourism not showing up, I would want to say that 1 to 10, maybe not necessarily 9, but 1 to 10, would have a sort of umbrella effect on tourism and how far the sector itself can be developed. If you just sit back and look at each one of those, you will see how that could happen, how it impacts on the sustainable development of tourism. 2, really surprised that disaster risk reduction is that low down, because I think every small island developing state needs to have that, front and center in terms of how they behave, how they treat with the environment, how they prepare themselves for, whether it's marine disaster, hurricane, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, this has to do with the length, the period of time for this SDP. I was cringing a little bit when I heard, anything from 15 to 25 years. I think if there's one thing that COVID has taught us, is that these long-term plans just don't work anymore, can't work anymore. Nobody saw COVID coming, and we're certainly not going to see whatever the next thing is coming. So we need to have plans that are, that can be nimble, that can be changed and focus change and so on going forward. So, my personal thing was 10 years. Even if you look at it from a governance perspective, according to when the plan is implemented, 10 years gives a government, a ruling government, 2 terms in the Montserrat context. As I said, depending on when it's implemented.
Yeah.
But I think, I think anything beyond that kind of gave me some shivers.
Yes. There have been a lot of discussion around that, but I think that even those who talk about a longer period talk about the review periods and that taking on board whatever lessons for the next review period. So there are ways to capture that, but all of the comments are coming forward. Yes, ma'am.
This process is a really difficult process for me because our reality is that we're coming out of a very devastating period where we lost key infrastructure, housing stock, farmlands, and other important things. So it's often not easy to just look at a number of priorities and decide which comes first. A lot of things have to go on at the same time when we are rebuilding key infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for me to accept this, and I guess we are just one contributor, one group who's contributing, but when the development experts and the policy experts come together, they will take this information on board, but they also would have guidelines as to how a country, nation builds and develop and so on. I think Warren mentioned disaster risk reduction being low, but the Sustainable Development Plan is a tool, but sustainable development is also an organizing principle, so that in each of those priorities, we have to integrate sustainability into them. Yeah. So we are building back better, and we're creating a more resilient healthcare. You mentioned the building code for housing. So disaster risk is really not down there. It's in all of those priorities coming down. And the same thing for housing and population. They're tied together. Food security is tied to population. So there's so many interlinkages that it's difficult to come back and say, these are the 3 or 5 priorities that we should be focusing on. For me, we should be focusing on rebuilding key infrastructure and systems. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and we must remember that out of 3 action planning workshops, we already have 46 actions. So these were just, and you are right, it's the old concept of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, you know, and there are harmonization and integration processes that must take place. But this also acts as a way to get the stakeholders thinking through the process and buying in from their perspective.
Yes, thank you. I am repeating something that I've often said whenever I attend such gatherings, and it is the predominance of government employees at these meetings and the absence of other stakeholders, the business people, the other groups that I think should be here that perhaps are not here because of the timing of these meetings. The fishermen, the farmers, the persons that work in the industries that are out there. And I think perhaps we should always consider having them a little later, because just look at the people that are in here. I mean, I represent the private sector, but I cannot speak for everybody in the same way that government has so many different departments here represented. In the same way, private sector should have all of the different groupings. The bankers, they were here, they're not here anymore, but he was here, somebody was here. The legal, you know, just name them. I'm not seeing that. In future, I'm calling for it again. We need such representation, and I keep saying it. And you know, let's just make a greater effort somehow to do that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that, and that's a concern. I must say, though, that the economic development sector was one of the most engaging of private sector, where you had bankers and so on staying for the full day and contributing to it. The second thing is that there is already a commitment that you are right. The sort of workshop setting may not be the best one for fishermen, for farmers, and other groups. So the process is going to go focus groups outside of the regular hours, whether it's night or what, to those groups. Farmers in the evening, where they gather. Fishermen in the evening, or the appropriate time where they gather. And other identified. So far we have identified fishermen. So far we have identified farmers. We have identified youth and children. And we have also identified, we have on here, having a focus group with the diaspora. So that it's not just the concept of the vision for Montserrat is not just those, it's the expanded Montserrat. It's those who live, but those who have a commitment to the country, who live outside of the immediate geographical area.
Thank you. I just want to comment on disaster management or disaster risk reduction, whichever we want to call it. I think the bigger heading, first of all, it doesn't surprise me that it has scored so low. We've always said in the disaster management field that there's always some money someplace to fix something if it happens. So we don't spend money. It's like paying insurance that you may never use. But every single heading or subtopic up there should be underpinned by some risk reduction, but also recovery plans. So Montserrat, for example, has a risk register. We assessed, we listed them and assessed the vulnerability. We had about 32 things that can go wrong. One of them is epidemics or pandemics. And every sector, so the health sector, should have underpinning whatever plan it has, a response and a recovery. And now the Caribbean on a whole, we see disaster as when a hurricane comes, heavy rainfall events, earthquakes, volcanic events. The creeper events, like COVID, for example, they last longer, they cost more, and you never figure out or have a clear line of when you're coming from responding to recovering. and it makes it really, really expensive. And by the time you catch up to a point where you say, okay, we're no longer responding, we're recovering, if there's an economy around it, the economy in your region or the world has gone so far ahead. So if there were opportunities for your country around them, you'd lose them. My encouragement would be for disaster risk reduction, the whole management system to underpin every sector, every major sector. So you don't necessarily need to be calling it a disaster plan for the country, but every sector should have a plan on if something happens to us, how do we recover? So if we have a pest problem, for example, food security, if you have a pest problem, like one of the hurricane system brings locusts from Africa like it did to Trinidad some years ago, it wipes up everything in 2 or 3 days. But it may just be on the back of a hurricane, the boat from Dominica cannot come to Montserrat. Waters are still too rough, they're looking after their business, they may lose that vessel. What is your plan for it? What do you do? What are the options you have? And something that you can pay for probably yourself or start doing yourself until help arrives.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave your comment to come forward and say my wrap-up, and when you have made your comment, Ms. Eswick is going to take over. But my comment is that my role in this, and it's a commitment, we are part of a 2-person consultancy team. Mr. Albert Daly, that some of you know well, who lived here for a number of years, is leading on this, and there'll be a continuation. This is really the beginning of the process to get it together, and there will be. So I want to thank some person have invested just not 1 day, but 2 or 3 days in the process, and I call it an investment of time. And I'm enjoying the buy-in that you are giving, and it makes it easier to produce a situation that you are committed to. So after your comment, you won't hear back from me, so thanks for your participation. You can go straight to Ms. Esther.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to say that I don't think we should feel bad about some of the lack of accomplishment of the goals as set out in this SDP, because the issue is and has always been a matter of funding. So if we step back and we look at what was written in this document, none of it was pie in the sky. We didn't set out to go to space. We were doing fundamental things in nation building that all other countries around the world have been doing. Nothing in it was, rocket science. But we were stymied along the way by lack of funding. How are we going to change that? One of the ways I think we need to address this from one of the angles is to understand and appreciate who and where we are currently as a country. And I use the word country advisedly, because we're not a country in the true sense of the word. We are territory. We are a territory that still currently has an administering power. That's the term. An administering power that is responsible, or I should say supposedly responsible, for bringing us to a particular stage where we can then have we can have the aspirations even now, but where we can realize the notion of self-governance. If we're still here 25 years later, operating an emergency hospital, where if you stump your toe now and you go to the casualty, you have to wait outside, literally outside. What are we saying? Anybody who is responsible for the development of Montserrat and the advancement of Montserrat has to be embarrassed by a situation where we're still having a temporary facility as our hospital. What about standards? They apply standards to the airport. You have to have 5 security guards in a room for one person to pass through. Otherwise, the airport will be shut down. However, you can't have a triage nurse at the hospital. You can't have doctors available. How does that make sense? So these are the issues I think we need to address, and we need to insist upon standards. Standards in every facet of life in Montserrat. And once we insist on standards that are applicable to British citizens, then perhaps, hopefully, we can get someplace. And lastly, in the same vein, I want us to stop referring to the United Kingdom as a funding agency. The United Kingdom should not be, in terms of Montserrat, a funding agency. The United Kingdom is the administering power for Montserrat with certain responsibilities. Unless we think that it is notional that this territory is their possession, lest we think it is notional, just cast our minds back to what happened in TCI a few years ago and what is happening in BVI now, where they think they can come in and control because what? It is their territory. So we must demand what their responsibilities are and what should come to us as a territory, British overseas territory populated by British citizens. Let me end it there. Thank you.
Sorry, something I had forgotten to mention that I found interesting was the absence of the development of the human capital. Yes, but in the sense, why I said that, because I think a lot of times we forget that the most important component in this whole Montserrat thing is us, the people. And because when we use education and training, it still seems a little like an academic exercise, rather than us saying it's the people who, at all levels, not just at the school age, it is from the cradle to the rocking chair, who we want to develop, to maximize the development of these individuals so that they can maximize the development of the country. Because it is without capacity. Because as I was saying to my table there, if we had a hospital built, but if we don't have any nurses or doctors to function within the hospital, we could get the hospital as the infrastructure and all the equipment in there. But if we cannot make it functional, what is the use? And it is the same way, because in terms of our thinking of, whether it be regards to what Brother West was saying in terms of how we relate to the UK, and even see how we deal with the aspect of financing our objectives. If we don't develop the capacity of our people and the mentality in such a way that we can enhance the development, where are we? That's something I wanted to just throw out here, that as we go forward, because even as we say, we are pulling in others within the overall business, fishermen, whoever, are we pulling them in such a way that we can eke out of them what we need in terms of their input for the overall development? Because it is we as a people who are going to make the difference. And if we are not equipped, can we make the difference? That's the question.
I take it that those are all the comments at this stage. And yes? Okay, there'll be other opportunities, certainly. Okay, so we have come now to the end of today's activities and the wrap-up time and next steps. So I wouldn't go over what Mr. Spence has done in terms of wrap-up, but I think he already summarized very well our efforts here today, and I personally am quite pleased with not just the 49 persons we had in attendance, but more so the participation. It was rich discussion, and it doesn't end here. So it's a lot of food for thought that we are all going to be going away with. Remember, this, as I said, is just phase 1 of the consultations, and we will be resuming in January. It shows me, though, that there is interest, appetite for, and buy-in and potential in terms of the contributions that we can make and we will be committing to going forward. Now, while we were here today, we had an online viewing, small numbers, but I want to share with you, we didn't have many comments, but I think it's useful just to share the comments. And earlier this morning, when we were looking at the visioning, someone mentioned, said, why should we reconsider being called a God-fearing nation? Why would that be on the table for discussion? Second comment, I think the focus on the SDGs is excellent, but many of them are incredibly difficult to achieve. Spelling out the practical steps, funding, and the legislative gaps will be very important. And they mentioned that the report on the UN, the 2019 UN mission to Montserrat, does address some of these. Someone supported the comment that was made about solar and wind energy. And another comment that resources are a major challenge. It doesn't make sense to continue to try to fix everything at one time. Pick an area. Find the synergies across all the sectors to make it work. And then there was another person fully agreeing with what Mr. West presented. So those were our comments online. I'm taking it, Veronique, that there are no more comments to this point. Okay, so we have no more comments. Now, our objective, when I started, I indicated that we were here to sensitize and validate. I think we achieved that because we had persons here who participated in the workshops, we had some new persons, and then we had the online viewers. So that was our way of sensitizing. And those persons who participated in one workshop, they were able to become familiar with the information and the outputs from the other workshops. So it was, I think we did well there in terms of broader sensitization. And validation, the exercises that we did, because you were presented with all of the outputs, you were able to, well, we ran the poll, and these are the results. This is not the end again. This is just food for thought. So what next? We first have to clearly define what happens for the next 10 months. We've already gone 2 months into the process. We mentioned that Mr. Daly, who led the previous SDP, he will be here again to continue the process come January. Someone has mentioned that they had some concerns about the group and the fact that it was heavily public sector. I want to say that we cast our net wide, so it's not for want of inviting persons. However, I take the point, and the very key point, that the timing of the workshops may not be, they are not convenient for a lot of the private sector persons. However, representation, we always encourage, if you have groups, we try to invite persons from within that grouping. In addition to that, our focus group arrangement will be that we plan to go to those persons, meet you on your ground. So it won't be always coming here. So we need to go to persons. The fishermen, we're not going to get them to come here, for example, right? We will go to them. And other groupings, we plan to meet with the youth, for example. Then We had our online viewers, and of course, I'm going to reiterate the point that because I was asked several times, why is it that the diaspora are not able to contribute to this forum? They have been they have been online viewing. We received a few comments. However, this is not the time we considered for them to be joining in the discussion at the level of participation that happened here today. It's not practical, and we have to accept that. So we have planned for the diaspora a special focus group which will be properly arranged, and we will give them enough notice, and we will be reaching out to the various groupings. We are aware that there is now a diaspora database, contact persons. We will be using that to our full advantage for this purpose, okay? We also spoke about the SDG, incorporating the SDGs into what we are doing. I want to also highlight again the point I made earlier that we are working along, or ECLAC is working along with us in developing this Sustainable Development Plan. And part of the thrust is aligning what we are doing with the SDGs. So that is at the forefront and the center and at the bottom of what we are doing. We also recognize the need for a sound communication strategy. Without that, we will not be getting the reach that we need to make this really effective. Persons still are not aware, 12 years on, and there are persons still saying that they do not know about the SDP. They've never seen the document. At this stage, if we are going to be wanting something from persons, wanting their contributions, they must be as aware as possible about what we are doing, why we are doing it, and have their input in terms of how do we get where we want to go. To inform those next steps, a report will be published, shared with all of us who participated and online, so that you get time to mull over the contents. And when we come back to you in phase 2, you would have had time to think about, to discuss, influence persons into participating, making contributions. So our communication strategy will include the provision of key reports to help you to make that determination as to where do we go from here? How do we get there? Why are we doing it? One of the things that was mentioned was funding. And that is something that I also want us here to think about. We do not want pie in the sky goals. We want to place things on the table that we figure are achievable within a framework where we can find funding or even try to identify possible sources of funding. And that should be key because any development plan requires funding. Okay? I also want us to focus on, more than anything else, outcomes, development outcomes, and not just doing. We have to have a reason for why we are doing. Otherwise, we will just be making little ad hoc achievements, but to what end? And we'll call them achievements because, yes, you'll see that you moved this from here to there, but did it impact something else? And we need to focus on outcomes. Standards as well. Someone mentioned standards in their feedback. We also have to take that on board when we are coming up with our outcomes, our goals. So let us look at this in a wholesome fashion, considering all of the things that we discussed, the challenges that were presented to us, and I am counting on every one of you here, all 49 persons who attended. 2, we are going to be reaching out to you. Reach out to 49 other persons, each of you, and ask them to reach out to 49 other persons. That way, we will be able to have a defined path and ensure that the vision that we set for ourselves is achieved. Thank you. Yes, the SDP document, it is online. if you Google Montserrat SDP, you will find it quite easily. And we have a few hard copies available. I don't know if persons are still interested in getting a copy or if you prefer to access it online. We also had, don't think there are any more available, but I think it's something in our communication strategy that we will adopt. We had a smaller version for everyday use, the Citizen's Guide, and it summarized very nicely everything that was in the larger document. So with that, thanks again for your full participation today, and let us continue on this journey together. Comment, and it says disaster mitigation should be in every aspect of our planning.